Constanza and colleagues 2017 provides a broad overview of the ecosystem service literature, where they understand these ecosystem services as nature services to human well-being. This figure captures that ecosystem services are produced in a complex system and illustrates that ecosystem services provide value through co-production and interaction with built human and social capital. Turning to the evaluation goals one can find in Costanza and colleagues on page 8, the paper describes that much of the practice of valuation is guided by determining willingness to pay for ecosystem services, which focuses on efficiency. The paper names fairness and sustainability as alternative valuation goals, but gives little detail on what it meant with the veil of ignorance method or with modeling with precaution. It instead refers to Costanza and Volke. The veil of ignorance refers to Rawls's theory of justice and is usually interpreted as a max-min objective, where one tries to maximize the well-being of those worst off in society across time. I will elaborate a bit more on Rawls's theory of justice next week. The sustainability goal refers to keeping economic activity within ecological limits, where modeling with precaution can be interpreted as leaving sufficient slack between environmental burden and carrying capacity. Arrow and Fisher studied the influence of uncertainty and irreversibility on economic choices more generally and found that if we are uncertain about the payoff to investment in development, we should err on the side of underinvestment rather than overinvestment, since development is irreversible. Given an ability to learn from experience, underinvestment can be remedied before the second period, whereas mistaken overinvestment cannot, the consequences persisting in effect for all time. If we translate this to the context of fishing, one could argue that uncertainty about the size of the fish stock gives reason for lower allowable catches, as overestimates and subsequent overfishing are likely to be more harmful and possibly irreversible than the damage from underestimation of the fish stock and underfishing. Costanza and colleagues list a number of uses for ecosystem service valuation. Their table 5 includes awareness, inclusion of the value of nature in national accounts, in policy evaluation, or in land use planning. Common asset trusts entrust the management of public assets to communities or collectives. Full cost accounting refers to providing estimates of external costs. Costanza and colleagues refer to the project True Cost that identified external environmental costs by sector regions. Here I have included table 2 from their study that shows the sector regions with the highest external costs overall. For each of these sectors, the external impact outweighs the revenues generated, with the worst ratio for cattle ranching and farming in South America, where public costs outweigh private benefits by nearly a factor of 20. Another increasingly popular application of ecosystem service valuation is in payment for ecosystem services. A recent global review of these programs by Salzman and colleagues describes that there are currently over 550 programs with an estimated $36 to $42 billion in annual transactions. To put these figures in perspective, this is roughly equal to the global annual revenues of the Coca-Cola company. Salzman and colleagues distinguished 3 broad categories of payment for ecosystem service programs: user-financed, government-financed, and compliance programs, where government-financed programs often have the dual purpose of rural development, and compliance programs refer to legal obligations of actors to offset their impacts. Salzman and colleagues show that payment for ecosystem programs are most prevalent in watersheds and rivers, where programs are aimed at, for example, flood control and water quality. These programs represent more than half of all payments for ecosystem service programs, both in number and value, where the largest share consists of Chinese programs. Salzman and colleagues describe that payment for ecosystem service programs aimed at biodiversity and habitat conservation are most often compliance programs, where one may offset impact by buying mitigation credits. This practice of offsets remains controversial, with opponents expressing worries that these facilitate and provide cover for more habitat destruction. Overall, these programs have seen limited success due to a lack of common metrics for biodiversity, and Salzman and colleagues highlight that while compliance programs help to create buyers of mitigation credits, these payments rarely are competitive with opportunity cost of keeping trees standing. Another literature review by Tsu Ermgassen and colleagues focuses on a subset of compliance programs that have a no net loss objective. Usually these no net loss policies follow a mitigation hierarchy that encourages participants to subsequently avoid impact, minimize it, restore local impact, and ultimately offset it elsewhere. So Ermgassen and colleagues, their study included 32 evaluation studies of policies that covered 300,000 hectares in biodiversity offsets, roughly equal in size to the Dutch province Groningen. The survey was limited to the English written literature, which may help explain the lack of programs in Latin America or Asia. About a third of the programs reviewed achieved the no net loss objective. Most successful programs established an offset requirement or multiplier that was larger than 1. The authors noted that successful programs were limited to wetland programs, which were also the oldest programs, and possibly had more refinements to promote compliance. So Ermgassen and colleagues expressed concern over the most used metric of area offset, which neglects quality indicators or the extent to which an area was under pressure from development. No net loss type of compliance policies can lead to serious challenge or cost for further economic development. This can be seen from the ongoing Dutch nitrogen crisis, where many economic developments are on hold because regions are at their nitrogen concentration caps. The regulatory cap came into force by decision mid-2019. Since there have been frequent protests by farmers who have seen their possibilities to expand evaporate, and the government has rolled back speed limits on Dutch roads to create emission space for the building sector. The Dutch nitrogen crisis illustrates one of the potential challenges with command and control type of caps on local pollution concentrations. In case there are few possibilities to compensate nitrogen emissions elsewhere and emission rights are not regulated under some form of cap and trade, potentially more valuable developments, as for example building projects, are put on hold. Let me pause to note that the cap could still be welfare enhancing as compared to no policy, as there are significant health and biodiversity costs associated with nitrogen pollution. A recent overview by Erisman and colleagues shows that health costs are mainly driven by nitrous oxides, with impacts ranging from lower life expectancy to more incidences of asthma and bronchitis, and this played in the table, albeit in Dutch. To better understand the biodiversity loss of excess nitrogen, it helps to point out that nutrient-poor ecosystems are paradoxically enough richer in biodiversity due to several ecological niches being filled by specialists. With excess nitrogen, these environments become more favorable to nutrient-loving generalists that start to outcompete more rare varieties of plants. Excess nitrogen also affects life in the soil, where fungi become less able to break down components of dead plant materials, and this in turn affects the balance between fungi and bacteria. This figure from Erisman and colleagues shows the consequences of high ammonia concentrations for root development of tree plant species. Let us return to the Costanza and colleagues 2017 paper for a moment. Suppose the authors search the literature for the best available value estimates of ecosystem services and add these estimates to obtain the worth of a square kilometer of coral reefs or mangrove forests. Table 4 shows several ways to combine these estimates. The papers on which I focus next use the basic value transfer aggregation method of assuming constant values within ecosystem types. Costanza and colleagues 1997 provided an estimate of the global value of ecosystem service by multiplying their best estimates with the size of these ecosystems. Their estimate valued the total ecosystem services between $16 and $56 trillion. The midpoint was about twice the value of global man-made GDP. Apart from showing that it is big relative to man-made GDP, some questioned the use of this estimate and argued that it can only be an underestimate of infinity. In my opinion, much of the value of this exercise reveals itself in combination with the replication nearly 20 years later, where Constanza and colleagues repeated the exercise with new estimates for the value of these ecosystem services. The total worth of nature was about 3 times larger than before. However, this increase in the value was only due to ecosystem services being more valuable than previously estimated. When we consider changes to the natural environment using these new estimates for ecosystem services, then we have lost some $20 trillion of ecosystem services. Meanwhile, the global man-made economy had increased by nearly 40 trillion. But obviously these two figures are nearly meaningless to compare, since the loss of natural capital affects many billions, while a large share in the increase in man-made capital is enjoyed by only a few percent.